All right, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Crisis Management Virtual Panel presented by the Harvard College of Business, Graduate Programs Office, and Graduate Career Services. I am Franco Prandi, the Director of Graduate Career Services, and I will be the moderator for today's event. Assisting me today is Danielle Corrigan, Assistant Director for Graduate Career Services. She will manage the Q&A process for today's event. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items for attendees. We will use the Q&A function only for today's event. We will not use chat. The Q&A feature can be found at the bottom of your screen. If you'll click the Q&A icon, you'll get a pop-up window and you can enter your question there. Feel free to ask any question you'd like. We do ask that you include your name and email. We will try to get to every question, but if we run out of time and we don't get to yours, we want to be able to try and follow up by email and send you an answer that way. All right. So let's get to our panel. All right, we're very excited to have three Auburn alum join us today to talk about crisis management, a very timely and critical topic given the COVID-19 pandemic. So Jeff Rummel works for the Home Depot in Atlanta, Georgia as a supply chain analytics manager. He is a supply chain leader with a passion for developing motivated associates and leveraging data analytics to drive business results. He graduated from Auburn in 2013 with a bachelor's degree focused in supply chain management. Welcome, Jeff. Glen Scott currently serves as Senior Manager Advisory Services for Performance Improvement at EY in Charlotte. During his 20-year industry career, Glen has developed extensive experience in a number of areas, including operations management, human resources and leadership development, initiative management, material supply management, contract manufacturing, and qualification in FDA-regulated businesses. Prior to joining EY, Glen was a manufacturing, supply chain, and HR leader at Procter & Gamble. Glen is a 2002 graduate of the Auburn MBA program. Welcome to the panel, Glen. And we have Jesse Adams joining us, who is the General Manager for Digital Transformation for Delta Airlines. Jesse is responsible for the development, planning, and execution of Delta's Customer 360 initiative. Jesse previously held the title of Manager for Airport Technology, which supported efforts to enhance technology platforms across Delta's airports. Those initiatives included launching Delta's agent mobility strategy, North America's first biometric self-service baggage drop process, and supporting ongoing airport innovation. Jesse joined Delta in 2010 and has held additional roles in revenue management and network planning. Jesse is a 2006 and 2008 graduate from Auburn University, where he studied finance and economics. Jesse, welcome to the panel. We want to thank you all for carving out the time from your schedules to join us today. And we'll go ahead and jump into our questions. Jesse, we'll lead with you if that's all right.
Sure.
If you would, set some context for us. Would you share with us, this is a question for all three of you, share with us how your firm is managing the crisis from a strategic perspective. What are you seeing?
Sure. Well, thanks again, Frank, for having me. It's been a really interesting past 6 to 7 weeks at Delta in the airline industry. And if you go back to kind of the last big crisis that we saw in the Great Recession about 10 years ago, Delta at that point understood that we've got to build ourselves to be a sustainable company so that the next time you have another storm come, we can weather that storm. But I don't think anybody quite expected the level of crisis at which we have seen here recently. So there's been a lot of quick thinking around, like, what do we do? And this is really a crisis that's 9/11, the Great Recession, SARS, all rolled up into one, and we don't exactly know what to do with it. So the key themes, though, that I've seen over the past 2 months with this crisis have been safety of our customers and safety of our employees, making sure that those customers that are still flying feel safe on board. Because we want people to know that it's okay to fly and that Delta will look out for the personal health of our customers and our employees. But also at the workplace, we've started to spread out a bit more. Obviously, virtual is a thing now, whereas previously You had a few niche groups that were virtual. We've obviously all had to learn how to deal with it. The second big theme that we've run into is preserving cash, which liquidity is the name of the game for any company right now. And it just so happened that when demand dropped, we lost about 90+% of our cash that we expected to come in. And so how do we make sure we can pay our bills and ensure we meet our short-term obligations? So there have been various initiatives with voluntary leaves for employees. It's actually been pretty incredible to see the Delta spirit being alive right now, where we had roughly 40% of our company volunteer to take time off, unpaid. And lastly, the big theme is making sure that our future is protected. So to the extent we can keep our people, we build momentum coming out of this, but also we kind of redefine our vision. And the current group of people that are at Delta right now are the ones that set that vision for the next, hopefully, 100 years.
Okay, thank you. Jeff?
Okay. Frank and Danielle, I want to say thank you also for letting me join today, to get a chance to share some of these ideas with the Auburn family and hear how everybody else is managing this pandemic. There were a few themes that Jesse mentioned that I think align pretty well with some of the actions Home Depot has taken as well. And I think first and foremost, that's safety, both for the associates and the customers. So on the associate side, some of the first things that our company put in place were some of the distancing requirements within stores, limiting the number of customers at one time, as well as changing some of the store hours. And then specific to the customer, there have been a lot of efforts in that space as well. Also limiting the number of people who are in the store at one time, enacting different price freezes so that there's not somebody's not paying 3 or 4 times what they normally would for hand sanitizer, for example. There's also been a big effort to remove some of the normal spring promotions and ads that we would have in place, which is a little bit different than a typical disaster, in that we don't want to increase customer traffic because the customer traffic itself is a risk to other customers. One thing I would say that makes, I think, the Home Depot a little bit unique in this scenario is that we're an essential business currently, but we've earned that distinction through the way that we've participated in different weather events over the years. So whether hurricanes or tornadoes, there are certain product classes that we are going to carry and support those local communities. The big difference is with this pandemic, it's not one city that's been hit by a tornado or one coastal area that's been hit by a hurricane. It's the entire nation. And you see impacts with the suppliers that are manufacturing those goods, the distribution centers and the stores that are servicing those customers, really all the way up and down. And so there's been a lot of rethinking on our side in terms of what are some of those product classes that are going to be required to help people in the same ways that you would support a weather event. And then what are some of those things like PPE and cleaning, where it's a totally new experience and it's not something that we've really planned for in the past.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right, Glenn.
Thank you, Frank and Jesse, Jeff. Just to build on your comments, like you, our industry has certainly been affected, and being part of a services firm, a professional services firm, one of the things we had to think about is, our most important asset literally is our people, because our people are the ones who do business. So with 100,000 people, many of which are on the road every week, I think the first thing we had to do is think through, what does safety look like? And as Frank and Danielle and I were talking about this session, I looked at the calendar and realized I think this is for me only week 6 or 7 at home. And I think back in early March, what we thought was safe then is not at all safe now. So sort of phase 1 of it was, we'll recall everyone, all of us, from client sites, which had never been done. And then we'll work together in an office. Sounded like a great idea 6 weeks ago. And then as we started to learn more about COVID, particularly from our EY Asia firms, we realized that being together in an office was also not a good idea. And it wasn't just the obvious that you're in a open office area that's supposed to enable collaboration, but literally like living here in Charlotte, our office is in the Bank of America building. It's 40 plus stories. So if Jesse and Jeff want to get on the elevator at the same time I do, how do we do that? You know, do we wait in line? And that's on the way up. On the way down, I'm on a middle floor. So do I have to wait until everyone above me clears out? There just wasn't a practical way, I think, for us to do work. So that was why around March 15th or so, everyone was asked to stay at home when we closed all offices. I think the second piece of that is technology. Now, we're probably geared differently for most firms or companies because we are virtual most of the time. So I think just from an IT perspective, it was less of a problem. However, the clients we serve, so while consulting is not an essential business, I do serve food and beverage manufacturers who are deemed essential. So if I still need to do my work for them, and it's less about hours billed and more about literally keeping products going out the door, well, how do I do that? Because they may not have the technology. If you've been to a manufacturing plant, they're usually not the furthest along in IT. So how do I do that? So I think it was rethinking how we serve. And then I will say just, you know, sort of personally, since I manage a pretty large team coast to coast, we had to think through what does help look like for each of those team members. Mm-hmm. Because all of a sudden, all these support services that I could normally provide are gone because no one really should be entering a house. So I think to your point, Jesse, depending on the location, we really had to think through what that looked like because I have a team member in Manhattan. And her experience right now is extremely different from my team member who lives in Kansas City, right? Or even state to state, city to city. Mm-hmm. Certainly Georgia, I know has been in the news lately, but I think each state is going to be in the news as they figure out what this new normal is going to be. So that's, I would say, you know, from a people and a technology and just a methods of working perspective, I think that's something that I know we continue to think through and evolve almost on a daily basis, but certainly in our weekly leadership meetings on a weekly basis.
Great. Thank you for that. And it actually is a nice segue into my next question, which is about your teams, right? You've talked strategically, you know, how are you, or can you tell us a little bit about how you're managing your teams at the tactical level? Maybe Glenn, you could start since you were just talking about your teams.
Yeah, so from a technology perspective, we actually accelerated for those 100,000 users the deployment of Microsoft Teams. We were using another product before, and IT always loves it when we accelerate that much. But we had no choice, and thankfully it went off without a fault. But I will say even, you know, the video, there was a lot of conversation around, if you're an introvert, like I am, being on video all the time is not a lot of fun. I manage it, I can adapt to it, I understand it, but we had to establish some team norms around, you know, does every meeting need to be on video? Do only some meetings need to be on video? What's the etiquette? And we're still figuring that out, but my personal management rule is I want you engaged. Whether or not it's on video is really up to you, which a collaborative software helps you with that. I will say from a safety perspective, you know, I get daily alerts from each of the cities that my people are in terms of what the latest local, state, and national thoughts are. And I actually have meetings later today with one of my biggest clients thinking through, can we return to work with them? Or do we need to keep people remote? And I wish the engineer in me cries out for some sort of quantitative scorecard, but it's a matter, I think, of risk management. The only other thing I would share is what I keep remembering is this is an emotional journey, not just a work journey. Mm-hmm. So from a fatigue perspective, consultants, like many of us, are known for working long hours. I've really tried not only to have sort of office hours where we're on, but office or personal hours where we're off. Because just speaking for me, I can't do this 24/7. I need time to break away, you know, to help my family, to go for a walk, just do something where I'm not always on. And I found that more and more, the longer I'm removed from being with people. I think more and more people are turning it off midday or at the end of the day. So those are some of the things that we're seeing right now.
Okay. Great, thank you. Jesse, how about you?
Yeah, we almost had a different problem than what Glenn described, in that when this thing happened, there were certain teams, there were some within Delta that had an abundance of work, right? You go into hyperdrive to figure this thing out. But there were also other teams that virtually had their work stop. I mean, if you think about it, if you're flying 20% of what you normally fly, that's an 80% reduction in work, roughly, in terms of managing the scope of our network. And so when we kind of got knocked to the mat there at the beginning, right? This thing happened so fast, and you're down on the floor and you're a little dazed, and you get up. And step one for us was to figure out, all right, let's interpret the chaos here and understand it a little bit, but then very quickly set priorities for the team. Because if the worst thing that can happen right now are people are standing around not knowing what to do. And so it took an effort of getting alignment on those priorities, both within my leadership ranks, but also amongst my peers, and then having a very open and transparent communication path with the team. So we had resolved to catch up, preferably on video. I think to Glenn's point, video is a reality that has mitigated some of the issues of working virtually, but we resolved to communicate with one another once or twice a day at a minimum. That's everyone on the team. We have broader team meetings once a week. We had talked through, just sharing this with the other guys, virtual happy hours were a thing that didn't exist before. And there's a component of engagement. Engagement is like such a powerful word there. It's a hard thing to do, but virtual engagement is so important at a time when teams are really looking for their leaders for help and for direction.
Okay, thank you. All right, Jeff, your thoughts. Tell us about your team.
Sure. I think on our side, one of the first things that we saw specifically within our analytics organization on the supply chain side was a bit of a deprioritization of some of the research and development type projects we were working on, and really a full focus on supporting the run the business and the operational components of it. So how do we partner with the people in the field and our merchants and buyers to really get that fastest speed to customer and support those areas that need those products most. So that was, I think, in terms of priorities, one of the first things we saw. And then, like Glenn and Jesse mentioned, there's been just an increase, and I think I've been really pleased with the progress we've made in those virtual check-ins, right? So we've sort of leaned towards some what we call daily stand-ups. So just a quick 10-minute check-in with your immediate team, and then these weekly town halls where we can cascade information up and down across a larger group. And that way, you know, as this situation continues to develop and we're in different cities across the nation, it gives everybody sort of a one place to come together and have that same information. So that's been really important for us. One other tool, which I personally have really come to like, I don't know if you guys are familiar, it's called Trello, and it's a free project management tool. That's one. It can be shared across the team, and you can keep track of where people stand with different tasks. And that's been really helpful while we're all virtual and maybe not able to connect as frequently as we normally would. So like these guys said, really trying to leverage technology wherever we can to try and make that distance not seem so far apart.
Right, great. So we know that people cannot lead effectively as individuals if they are not fully present. So can you guys speak to, you know, what you're doing to take care of yourself so that you can lead most effectively? Jeff, I'll throw it back to you.
Sure. So I would say getting outside, at least for me, has been one of the biggest things to help my mental health. I think my dog's probably getting the best deal of this whole quarantine with all of the exercise that she's getting. Um, but that's been a big thing, and I think also just trying to find some different side projects that maybe you didn't have time for in the past, whether that be home projects or picking up a new game or maybe the guitar that you haven't picked up in a while. But it's been a lot of those types of things, and like these guys said before, it's a lot more maybe FaceTimes or virtual calls with friends and family, and just doing things like that to try and stay connected and stay like a part of something.
Gotcha. All right, Jesse, how about you? What are you doing?
Frank, I think the thing I miss most about being in the office are those random kind of pass-bys with people that you like seeing, right? Like we're built to be collaborative, and I loved running into people I hadn't talked to in a while in the cafeteria, and then you might schedule a coffee chat, and so there was this kind of regular catching up that just happens naturally, and that's missing if you're not intentional about it now. So one of the things that I've tried to do, acknowledging that, is likewise like going on a walk, but picking up the phone with and cold calling one of my coworkers while I'm on my walk. So that's my proxy for running into somebody in the cafeteria.
Nice.
And sometimes they're available, sometimes they're not, but I try to kind of shorten the gap between virtual and what it means to be in the office as much as possible, and having even informal conversations or networking conversations is just as important as it always has been.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. I like the idea of the cold call. That's interesting. All right, Glenn, what about you? What are you doing to take care of yourself?
Yeah, well, in all honesty, I'm still figuring out, I think, like we all are, but you know me pretty well. I'm pretty competitive. So I was training for a half marathon in Nashville, which has gotten pushed back, understandably. So there are virtual half marathons you can do, and I'm doing one by myself next week, but I'm going to try to do one with a few of my team members. And you actually, I got the packet yesterday. You actually get swag. So you get a shirt, you get a medal, and you get a bib. And it's like, even though you're running by yourself, it's like running a real event. So for me, it's a way, like these guys were saying, to connect and also sort of give me a goal to get me out of the house every day.
Mm-hmm.
I would also tell you, it's not just about me, it's about, my family as well. So my wife's job didn't convert as well as mine did to virtual. So she's had more free time on her hands. So we actually arranged a neighborhood drinking in the driveway every Friday, which we space, 10 to 15 feet apart at our park, but we just sort of get in a huge circle, and it's less about the drinking and more about just talking to each other and asking how, I've got neighbors who work for the Panthers, for the Hornets, for Duke Energy, how are you dealing with all this? And it's been sort of a nice way to tie up the work week, where you realize that, I know we're not alone, but it's nice to actually see someone physically. So we have a little mixed contest going on right now in terms of best drink, but I think beyond that, everyone's just sort of ready to get out and talk to people again.
And be connected. Yeah. The competitive side, the best drink. We'll have to check back with you on that.
I can help.
So our next question is for the entire panel, is more high level about crisis management plans in general, right? As you've been in this scenario and have described what your firms are doing, what you're doing, can you talk more generally about crisis management plans and maybe some of the key elements that you think, if you think about who our audience is, what are things that they need to think about as they go out into leadership positions? And Glenn, we'll start with you.
Sure. So we've looked at crisis management specific to this pandemic, but also with any sort of pandemic or business interruption, as 3 phases. So now, next, and beyond. And I think most of our clients right now are somewhere between now and what's next, which would be recovery. But I think to answer your question, the specific elements we start with are people. So everything that Jesse and Jeff also touched on, what does people security look like now? Because at some point, I would imagine we are going back to an office building. What does that look like? Are we going to have to take out half the cubes? Because, I think everyone has pretty much gone to an open office space. How do you collaborate now? Are we going to have to make the rooms bigger we collaborate in? So there's a whole leg of making people feel safe. And there's also a practical aspect, which is, I think the limiter right now in Charlotte is childcare. So if you have any working professional who doesn't have someone else other than a professional to care for their kids, it's pretty unlikely they're going to be effective at work, even if they arrange something back. So I think there's that sort of Maslow's hierarchy piece. So you start with people, but I think also on top of that, again, understanding the industry I work in, which is food and beverage manufacturers, how do you restart the supply chain? And you're seeing examples of that now. I don't think I've ever seen supply chain talk so much on, like the daily news, right? Because I think this week it's meat. Meat production is down 40%, fresh meat. And for my food companies, that gets into a label claim issue because you can't claim you have freshly made product if you can't get it. So that could actually shutter a whole line of plants. So, everything I learned at Auburn of thinking through contingency planning, no one thought of this. Even the best business continuity plans in the world didn't envision a global shutdown. Mm-hmm. And also in food, many of the components now probably have to come from the US because they may have had a backup plan, but it could be Canada or Mexico. And I think it's an open question right now whether or not the FDA and USDA will allow that. So there's, again, that sort of process piece. And I think the third challenge is technology. Most companies have been strained with people working from home. They may also be strained with people coming back from what does workplace support look like now? So if Jeff and Jesse and I are sitting in an office, are we going to have to act differently with working from home, not working from home? What technology can I specifically say? And that's on top of making things digital, which I think every workplace is going to. So is it in person? Is it digital? Is it a mix? So we're thinking through these phases as well as those specific things.
Okay. Thank you. Jeff, how about you?
Yeah, I think Glenn answered that very well. A lot of the same thoughts and themes on our side. I think first and foremost, any plan has to start with your associate safety. So if there's any impacted area, what can you do to keep them safe and keep their families safe? And wherever possible, can your company or group provide some sort of financial relief to those who are, directly hit by some sort of disaster like the one we have here? And I think the one second theme is what can you do as a firm or as a team to increase your options, right? So are there opportunities for you to increase your capacity of a certain thing, whether it's labor or supply? And what are those things you can also do to increase your flexibility or nimbleness to address a customer's needs or an area that's been particularly impacted? Kind of like we've been saying throughout this panel, though, one of the particular challenges with this pandemic is that it is national and that it is global. So you can't necessarily lean on, say, your West Coast facility to help support your East Coast, right, when things happen like this. So that's definitely a nuance. I think no one maybe has the perfect answer for yet, but we're still all trying to figure that out as well.
Gotcha. All right. Glenn, what are your thoughts?
I agree with everything that's been said. I was thinking, as Jeff was talking, another challenge we're having is not only people coming into work, but in the case of where I work with the manufacturing floor, equipment coming in, which, by the way, is coming in from Italy and one of the hot spots. So, as crazy as it sounds, do we have to sanitize everything coming to the building? Can I, call Chipotle and have someone come in? Do they have to drop it at the front? That's some of those process things. When you actually start thinking through the complexity is what I would say is going to be reflected not only in sort of workforce practices, but my managing partner today was saying the 10K disclosures with COVID are going to be really interesting over the next year because I think it was Mondelez this week said they actually will not forecast for the rest of the year what their earnings will be. Wow. Because there is so much uncertainty, and I believe they're on a calendar year, so they can't forecast 9 months ahead.
Right.
Which makes it fun for all of us, because if they can't forecast, there's a chain reaction in consumer goods around. I think every consumer goods company is going to go, good, we don't have to figure it out either, so we're just going to tell everyone our material statement is none.
Right.
It's changing. It's a different place.
Okay. All right, and Jesse, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I think those are great points. There's the uncertainty is driving us to this place that, you know, no matter what your crisis management plan is, undoubtedly there are things that it doesn't cover in the current situation. Right. You can't anticipate every once in a century event and plan appropriately to that. So in my mind, like when you think about the most effective thing you can do are going to be those things that traverse a variety of situations. And for us at Delta, the most important thing that we're kind of leaning on for that is the culture and the core values. So if, you know, we have a 95-year history, and we've seen our fair share of things throughout that history, right? Like 9/11 was a pretty significant event in the airline industry. We went through bankruptcy in 2007. U.S. Airways attempted a hostile takeover in 2007. And then we had the Great Recession. But all of these things are things that we've been able to kind of build character with, and it taught a resilience. You know, you kind of hear some of the people saying crises build character, but I actually think crises reveal the character that's been built for a long time. And so what we're doing is heavily leaning on the core values that have been built throughout the years of perseverance, doing what's right for the customer, looking out for each other. These are all kind of material themes that play out. But on top of that, Frank, like establishing communication channels that work is super important. I think if we had not gone through some of the transition for getting on Microsoft Teams, or for ensuring email is available no matter what device you're on, or we tend to leverage WebEx as well. Like all these things, like Facebook Workplace was something we've adopted over the past several years to communicate internally at Delta. We are leaning so heavily on all of those channels to get the updates from our executives, from our immediate managers, but also to collaborate amongst each other. So ensure that the communication channels are mature enough that when you do need them, they're there.
Okay. Thank you for that. So one final question before we throw it to the audience questions. So what experiences or skills in your past have best prepared you to lead in this environment? And so Jesse, we'll throw it back to you.
Sure. I was a product of graduating during the Great Recession, which was a challenge, and it certainly one of those things where you learn perseverance when it takes you a while to find a job. And I know many probably listening on here may not have sort of like immediate success in finding a job when the time comes, especially if the scenario is looking towards a little bit longer recovery. But one thing that I've tried to do over the past, I don't know, even from when I was in college, is be a student of your environment and understand your surroundings. And so when you run into situations where it requires critical thinking around a crisis. Take note of that. Keep a notebook. I've got my own notebook of of things that we're doing right now during this current crisis that I may need in the future, may not. I can guarantee some of the themes are going to persist, whether it's a small crisis of missing a deadline or a big crisis of like one we're in now. Mm-hmm. So pay attention to your surroundings and really try to understand decision making and how the top leaders in the organization are making decisions with limited information.
Okay, great, thank you. Glenn, your thoughts?
Yeah, I was thinking, I guess one of the ways I've managed through this, to your point, Jesse, is having lived through some of those crises. And certainly our firm, in many ways, was as or even more impacted by the '08 crisis, given at the time consulting wasn't part of EY, it was still mostly the finance side. But one of the things I will directly say that ties back to some of the things I learned at Auburn is purpose. You know, you have to understand what your firm's purpose is about. Jeff, I think you touched on this, like what are our values? So it's not just something on a wall, but how do we live? And week 2 of the crisis, our CEO, she broadcast all 100,000 of us and said, let me be clear, within this fiscal year through June, we have already taken cuts in our distributions as partners to make sure not one person of you loses a job. And that alone, you know, rather than asking me to do more work or anything else, just saying you're safe, benefits will continue, mm-hmm. and it includes the non-client serving people. So our admins, the IT folks, and I think just being that clear mm-hmm. and that empathetic is hard to do. Mm-hmm. But you have to have purpose with empathy. Mm-hmm. And empathy is a little different for me than sympathy, because sympathy is a general feeling. Empathy means I've been through this, and mm-hmm. she had. And she shared back in '08, when she was at a much more junior level, how her leaders helped her through it. So I think the one thing I would point to that also goes back to, I think, how Auburn operates is none of us are alone. I mean, I certainly don't have all the answers, but with the Auburn family, and that's why, you know, Frank, you and Danielle know that's why I've continued the connection with Auburn. It's really that pay it forward mentality. And I know who to go to who has been through something like this. So I think everything, you know, you talk on campus, sometimes like the case studies, you're like, oh, that'll never happen. Well, actually, a lot of them are happening right now. Right. And just think about why some of the structure of the curriculum is what it is.
Great. Okay. Jeff, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of what Glenn said there would totally agree with, especially the thoughts around how can we use some of these major events that have happened in the past to make us more empathetic to the way we interact with our coworkers and our customers today. And I think specifically how you could prepare yourself would be as if you haven't yet had an opportunity to work either in operations or a client-facing role. I think those are great roles to really develop a sense of urgency, as well as to understand somebody's needs and, you know, what you can do to address those. So that's a great opportunity, especially for students entering the workplace. And then on that note, in terms of students who are about to graduate, I think it's really important right now, being similar to Jesse and graduating around the time of the previous recession. It's important to remain flexible, and I think maybe see your next position as a range of possibilities, as opposed to maybe something that is very specific. And I think having that flexibility will allow you to explore different avenues, at least even in your head, and potentially open some doors that you didn't know were there. So,
okay. Great. Thank you for sharing that, all of you. We're going to turn it over to Danielle now. Danielle, questions from the audience?
Yes, we do have several. So this question relates to how all of the participants are managing crazy changes in supply and demand. Specifically, Glenn, can you tell us about the meat supply chain and what to expect in the next several weeks?
Yeah, so my major client is a processed goods maker. So they use fresh meats in a lot of their products. And so what we're seeing that they're actually probably even more concerned about than supply, although I will answer that question, is whether they can be nationalized like the meat industry was this week with the Defense Production Act. I mean, that is a frightening thing for any company, but particularly for a publicly held company. That has some very serious implications. So the way they're managing both, I would say, that concern and the meat crisis is they're relooking at what their label claims are, and they're looking at, can they sub in either different ingredients, or if they can't, or if the consumers won't buy that, because you can't just assume, right, that what you put on the shelf a consumer will buy. They may have to actually switch to even a different product. So let's say, you know, they're using ready-to-made pasta and meatballs. They may need to sub out either a non-meat version or something else that uses frozen meat, you know, because if you've ever done artwork with any company, it usually is about a 6 to 8 week process to change artwork if there's a claim on it. You know, you have to go through multiple departments, including legal. You have to make sure from an FTC perspective, you're accurate in what you're saying. And most supply chains, particularly the meat one, you probably read in the news this week, they have, you know, millions of pounds of meat that's frozen. So you can switch to frozen, but you can't switch from frozen to fresh. So I think that is a supply issue. And there's also the transportation issue. Right. So I can tell you one of the biggest constraints with trucking right now is reefers or refrigerated trucks. There's a truck driver, when you think about his or her day, probably is one of the worst risk when it comes to COVID, not only because they may be carrying it, but they're hitting 10, 12, or even 15 docks a day. So there's another thing where even if you can get the meat, can you get it to a plant? And what if there's an impact at the plant? Does that mean it can't go to the DC, the mixing center, or ultimately the customer's dock? So I think meat is the beginning of it. And specifically some types of meat, right? Chicken, poultry so far seems okay, but pork has been hit and beef has been hit. But I think other components, at least in food, are at risk. So eggs right now, if you buy eggs, if you've noticed, I think the price, at least in Charlotte, has tripled over the past month. And the reason for that, to get a little nerdy here, is chicken farmers will not buy more chickens unless someone backs them up. Because during the last crisis around '08, people shifted their buying patterns. So as a farmer, why would I buy more just because actually I like the price of eggs going up? So there's this whole separate conversation in that industry about, will the government back us up like they do other, I call them crops or products. So I hope that helps. I know it's a long answer, but there's different issues legally, regulatory, and quite frankly, financially, for that problem to be resolved.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Jesse or Jeff, any comments on supply and demand in your world?
Yeah, I can weigh in. We definitely have a demand problem. Like I said, I think air travel right now is, for the next quarter, is less than 10% of what it was last year at this time. And that becomes an issue when, one, every carrier around the globe was geared up for growing. So air travel demand has pretty much steadily increased over the past several years. And each carrier was kind of setting themselves up to maximize on that. And so you go and order new airplanes, you defer retirements, anything you can do to keep flying. Well, now all of a sudden we've basically had to halt that. And there's been a lot of creativity around how do you pull out some of that capacity and not continue to pay interest on some of those borrowed assets or borrowed money. So, we've cut our schedule down by 80%. Most carriers have about the same amount. And if you just think about kind of what to expect going forward, I don't know that air travel is going to follow a V-shaped recovery path, which some other industries might follow. It's going to take people a while to get comfortable flying again. There's a lot of people on an airplane, and there's standards that have to be met to ensure personal hygiene. Going back to 2001, it took at least 2 years for the industry to recover. And so I think it's reasonable to think it's going to take at least as long for us to recover in this instance as an industry. But I do think things will return. Travel will return. It might take a little bit longer as people get used to virtual. And now business meetings don't need to happen in person necessarily. But there's no substitute for being there in person with your friends, family, seeing the landmarks across Europe. Like, there's no substitute for that. So we just have to build confidence that gets people comfortable with traveling again.
I think the only thing I would add there, specific to Home Depot or retail, would be in terms of supply and demand, how there's a shifting customer expectation to the e-commerce or online experience. So especially in the situation we are today, online delivery or curbside pickup has become more and more an expectation for some of these larger companies, whether it's groceries or consumer packaged goods or you name it. And I think that's one thing we will see continue after this is some people have said this is pretty convenient, or some people may be concerned to go into a large store, but whichever, I think that is going to be a trend that continues, is just a faster and faster adoption rate to that curbside pickup or that online delivery when you can.
Awesome. Thank you for all your answers. That actually brings me to one of our other questions that some of you have touched on already. As an essential business, you continue to have customers, but have seen a dramatic reduction. Obviously, the primary goal is the health and safety of your employees and customers, but as states begin to reopen, people are still going to be nervous. What are you doing to incentivize or encourage customers to return to your company? I'll let whoever wants to kick off with that one.
I can hop in, maybe get us started. I just kind of touched on a little bit the need for customers to feel comfortable. And I would say that's probably going to be the same for Jeff and Glen across their businesses as well. And so it's, as we've started to implement new measures around blocking part of the airplane or reducing the touch points with flight attendants, we've had to communicate that out to the customer pretty consistently to kind of show them that, listen, we're thinking about it. Here are some of the measures that we're putting in place. And what's challenging is, certain states are starting to open up, but other states are not quite moving as fast. And when you think about air travel, most of the traffic happens state to state or US to international country. And so it has to be a reciprocal feeling on kind of the level of openness within the economy of the places customers are traveling. If one place does it and another doesn't, then the customer is not going to travel. So there's some amount of waiting that needs to happen. And I know our leadership ranks are tied in very closely with CDC and the White House to get a finger on the pulse of when that is. But in the meantime, like instituting measures that make the customer feel comfortable is the number one priority.
Yeah, I think to add to what Jesse was saying, in terms of encouraging consumers to come back and shop, I think there's going to be an effort with a lot of businesses to continue reducing that friction between the customer and the seller. So things like self-checkouts, I think things like spacing when we're standing in line at different stores. I think some of those processes are going to become more and more normal and give us all just a little bit more confidence in that these retailers and these companies are doing the right things by when they do allow crowds back into their stores.
I think that's a great point. And Jesse, obviously my firm is a big customer of yours. So I would say, we're also learning from you and from you, Jeff, at, how are, you've been client or consumer facing throughout the crisis. So what have you learned? I think for my clients, what I'm trying to be sensitive to is, what makes you feel safe? Is it that, we'll be on site 1 day a week now instead of 4? We want to wear masks. You want us in a room, maybe, that we only send 2 people instead of 4, with 2 people working remote now to meet your need. We're trying to figure that out, because I don't think anyone right now has the answer, but we're trying to say, here how other industries like Jesse's and Jeff's are managing that. Again, going back to values, our number one thing is keeping your people and our people safe. Here's how we're going to do that. And it's an ongoing conversation, and a very real one. I mean, I have a call 2 hours from now about how part of my team can return to work over the next month. And we are going through these very things around, how do we get there? What does that look like? Even very tactical things like, let's say I have a 4-week engagement with a client. Do I now need to rent 1 hotel room per person for the whole month, just so there's not this in and out of people like there are in most hotel rooms? Do I need to have them there 2 weeks instead of 1 week with a week off? Like, we're figuring this out ourselves, because most of our clients in today's world don't want us going out Monday, home Thursday, back and forth. And, they think that's higher exposure and higher risk, which it could be. So it's, it's an open dialogue, I think, and we're probably not going to get it completely right, whatever right is at first, but we're going to try to be flexible to what they're telling us.
You touch on a good point, Glenn. There's a need for speed with these types of decisions, right? Like, we need to get back to the business quickly. But inherent in that, and inherent in the uncertainty, is that we're going to make mistakes. And I think it's important to be transparent, but also kind of set expectations with your team, your clients, and your customers, that we might get it wrong, but we can assure you that we're hearing you and hearing your feedback, and we'll adjust appropriately.
Right. Agreed.
All right, I think we've got time for one more question, Danielle.
All right. Let's go with, given the crisis and the economic headwinds and the upcoming recession, what advice would you give students as they prepare for entry into the workplace? Glenn, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah. Wow. That's a big question.
I was waiting on Glenn to start.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Yeah, I can't do the mute button on video, can I? I think the biggest thing I would say is, please have hope, because I can tell you, in supply chain, our projections are, once there is some sort of normal where, to your point, Jesse, risk can be managed, we think business is going to be absolutely crazy, because most of the firms that are shipping to stores right now have run through their inventory, and they have plants running full out, including through Easter, which hardly ever happens at these plants, just to keep up. So demand at one of my clients since March 7th, I think, if you look at the IRI data, is up 33%, right? That's unheard of. That's a whole year's worth of demand increase in 6 weeks. So we feel like, from a hiring perspective, we will have more work than we know what to do with starting in July and August. So if there's a very specific piece of advice, I think, looking probably more in your world, Jeff, at digital, understanding how digital capabilities can accelerate production or financial results. I would look at that, pull everything you can from Harvard's, knowledge on that, because that is what I would tell interviewers. I can join your team with these skills and help you in this area. So think about what they're hiring for and tailor the discussion that way.
That's great.
I think if I could piggyback off Glenn there, one opportunity for students that are just finishing up this spring, A lot of services right now are offering, free learnings or free publications or free classes. So this could be a great opportunity to get a certificate that maybe you've been putting off, or like Glenn said, building that resume so that when those interviews do come, hopefully very shortly, you've got maybe some extra things that you can point to that you learned and did during this period. And I think the only other thing I would add is as you do your research for the company you want to work for, like Delta and Ernst & Young and Home Depot, you really need to pay attention to company culture and the leadership of those organizations, because I think that really starts to tell you how things will be handled if times do get tough. So I think that's really important, maybe not something I took enough focus on when I was first coming out of school, but would highly recommend.
Yeah, and there's going to be several people, I imagine, that are challenged with this idea that when unemployment rises, it becomes more competitive to find those fewer jobs that are out there. And these are people that you're competing with that have multiple years work experience. And so the challenge is going to be showing both, one, that you have the potential to exceed over a 5, 10 longer term career, but also like do whatever you can to stuff your resume in this time. So I remember when I was coming out of school in 2008, and it was in the middle of the credit crisis, and work experience was a problem for me in that it was very limited in what I had to offer in that regard. Great grades, like school was fine, but the work experience was the knock. And at some point I realized, like, I've got to put something on the resume. I got to put something on the resume. And so I went to a couple of firms and offered to do, even if it was grunt work, unpaid, for some period of time, so that I can put your firm on my resume. And I don't know if everyone needs to go to that same length, or if that's even feasible for some people, but whether you're a sophomore, a junior, or a senior, do what you can to stuff your resume so that when jobs do open up, you start to see people that both, one, have a great education, but two, they have some experience with how to think in a corporate culture.
All right. Awesome. Gosh, so many great points, so many great perspectives shared. You've given us a lot to think about. I really want to thank you all for being with us today and carving time out of your very, very busy schedules to share your insights. It's been tremendous. It's exactly what we were hoping for. So thank you for that. Attendees, we will go ahead and end the meeting here. For those whose questions did not get answered, we will take a look at those and see if we can engage with our panelists to get you some answers there. All right, thank you again. Jeff, Glenn, and Jesse, fantastic. Again, War Eagle, and have a great rest of the week.